So why did we do this series and why today? Well, because our analysis as socialists is that there is an urgent need to build an anti-imperialist movement today in light of three interlocking crises. Imperialist wars are on the rise, and it's leading to massive ecological devastation and creating an existential threat to humanity. Simultaneously, the capitalist class is profiting off of automation, relying on laying off hundreds of millions of workers across this country to replace us with automation in order to exploit and to keep us down. And so it is more urgent than ever for us to come together and to build together an anti-imperialist lens of how to move forward. We think that often people hear about anti-imperialism struggle in a historical context. We know of the Vietnam War, we know of the Korean War, but what we're living in today is a new Cold War, and that is our reality, and we need to build a strong anti-imperialist movement today. And so I want to invite all of you to chant with me, and as we say, Free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
U.S. out of Korea!
U.S. out of Korea!
U.S. out of the Philippines!
U.S. out of the Philippines!
U.S. out of Asia!
U.S. out of Asia!
U.S. out of everywhere!
U.S. out of everywhere!
Resistance until liberation!
Resistance until liberation!
Reunification!
Reunification!
And return!
And return!
Thank you, everyone. We'd like to invite our co-organizers, Michelle Kim from Woori Center, and Gayon from K4D, who will be providing a recap of the initial political teaching on Gwangju.
So we wanted to start off by doing a quick recap and review of on May 8th, we did a political teach-in talking about the Gwangju uprising, and then we also on May 18th did a movie screening of The Taxi Driver, as Tina just stated. And in 1980, the Gwangju uprising happened in Korea, and these two pictures here really symbolize the Gwangju uprising in numerous ways. I want to bring it to the audience. Looking at these two photos, what similarities do you notice? What do you see from these two photos? You could just call it out.
Community?
Community, yeah. From both of these photos, people are caring for one another. There's community solidarity, and while this was a horrific instance in which there was mass killings, torture, destruction that happened in Gwangju and all across Korea, we also saw a movement of resistance, a struggle against oppression, and really liberation that happened across the city for, while a short time, a really important period. You can see on the photo on the left, civilians made in mass rice balls for one another, chumokbap, which some of you guys might have gotten a chance to eat. Those rice balls, really there wasn't many resources, so it was really just rice and a little bit of salt for taste because they didn't have the resources to make it a little bit more delicious. So we added tuna and Spam, so it might not be completely accurate, but it is now a symbol that's of resistance that's used all across Korean social movements and made regularly. On the right, you can see Gwangju citizens also in mass donated blood. There were massive blood transfusions, all kind of given in hospitals and many areas because, of course, so many brutal killings happened, and in order to support, we had civilians just kind of come out and make sure to give these blood donations. Gwangju was a really dangerous city at the time because it was extremely poor, but we also didn't see any riots, looting, robberies that happened, which is very striking to notice, what we did instead see was actually the military itself participating in tons of looting. So now that we kind of did some grounding of the Gwangju Uprising itself, one important element of the Gwangju Uprising is it not only represented this period of liberation and struggle, but also just a manifestation of US imperialism and a buildup that had happened after years and years of US control of Korea. So prior to US imperialism, Korea was occupied by the Japanese Empire from 1910 to 1945. For decades, the Korean people were subjugated in various policies of cultural, political assimilation, forced labor, complete control of land and resources, and really suppression of any sort of opposition and dissent. The Japanese left in 1945, and we then immediately see the United States take advantage of that situation, invade Korea, and control Korea through a series of military dictatorships. One of these instances that we can't ignore is the Korean War, which represents this period of US imperialism within Korea. And often the Korean War is not talked about in the United States. If it is talked about, it's described as the forgotten war. And this is intentional, right? During the last political teach-in, I spoke about how media organizations in capitalist societies primarily serve the interests of capitalist governments and the corporations that own them. So intentionally, we have the United States frame this war as something that's insignificant, as minute and unimportant. What we know is that's not true. It's intentionally done in order to dismiss and hide US's true involvement in Korea. So it's from 1950 to 1953, but we know that the conflict on the peninsula happened well before 1950. By 1950, over 100,000 Korean people had already died with the aid of the United States. And with that, there was brutal suppression, there was of any sort of socialist uprising, particularly in Jeju Island, which was supposedly autonomous. And we also had the mass targeting and murder of various suspected communists all across the Korea region. The United States participated in mass bombings, bomb raids all across Korea, and then also just brutal murders of civilians all across the region. Korea was used as this political pawn in the Cold War chess game. What is often described as the USSR being the primary aggressor in the Cold War. It's widely believed, or at least told to us, that the United States was deeply invested in long peace post-World War II. And US narratives and media tell us that the Soviet Union and Kim Il-sung, their political lackey, decided to invade Korea completely unprovoked. The United States then, of course, in order to respond to the crisis, had to protect its own self, the Korean people, and global democracy, which of course we know is a familiar narrative that's often told in order to justify America's involvement in different regions across the world. We can go to the next. So looking at the legacy of US imperialism, we can see what actually happened in Korea, particularly North Korea, was mass destruction, with 40 to 90% of cities and towns in North Korea completely destroyed. Pyongyang, its capital, was reduced to rubble, and 20% of the entire population was murdered, with many of those people being civilians. There was 635,000 plus tons of bombs dropped in North Korea, which is more than in the entire Pacific theater throughout World War II. And if we look at the Korean people themselves, it's all but a forgotten war. This has had deep trauma and pain across the Korean people, and the inability for any sort of real coexistence. And I think about my own grandpa, who fought in the Korean War alongside his brother and lost him amongst the battle, and it's believed that he kind of went over to the North Korean side and was never able to see his brother because of that. When looking at the economy of both North and South Korea rapidly becoming developed in the years since, and North Korea falling off, it's a great example of how under an American hegemony, we've developed a world economic system in which we punish one state and incentivize other states that undergo hypercapitalism. And what we also do learn is it highlights how American imperialism functioned by design. Rather than being this series of misguided fuck-ups, which is often what is framed, under this kind of mindset shift, we can understand the people's intentions who carried out these policies, their interests, and also understand some of these social histories that are often neglected. This can be applied to, of course, Korea, the Philippines, South America, Iraq, and of course, Israel and Palestine. I think with that, wanting to pass it over to K4D to make this connection with their statement around student activists and modern day and how this important event with the Gwangju Uprising and with US imperialism kind of impacts us today.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for the wonderful context. And just to kind of add on to a lot of things that have been said, like, is this working? No, it is. Okay, awesome. It is like really heavy to say that the Korean War is the longest running war like ever. And to just even like digest those words is like, for me, really like painful. I think we oftentimes like find ourselves desensitizing ourselves to these like really brutal and violent histories. But truly these are part of like our legacy and how we can choose to resist and react even today. So connecting this to student movement, we have seen globally how powerful students have, the student movement is, and just like galvanizing the masses to just stand up and not being afraid and being bold and brave. And I think K4D at Penn, along with the student organizers at UC Berkeley, UCLA, and Reed College, we produced this hands-off student statement to stand in solidarity with all the students who have been violently targeted by the US government. But also I specifically want to connect it to Gwangju and like just the history of Korea. Because it's a statement I will be reading from my phone, if that's okay, but I really do encourage you all to also check out our Instagram, which has a statement as well as like a really cool video that all the K4D chapters made regarding like the student movement itself. So anyways, as Korean students and comrades in the diaspora, we reflect on Korea's revolutionary history. We honor our ancestors and martyrs who unapologetically and militantly resisted our Japanese colonizers. Only a few months ago, the masses in the Republic of Korea poured onto the streets, demanding the impeachment and arrest of former President Yoon Suk-yeol. From organizing anti-US militarism actions to collective candlelight protests, the Korean people have demonstrated time and time again the unspeakable power of what it means to show up and show out for your community. By honoring the violent yet beautifully militant legacy of the Gwangju Uprising, we see parallels between what happened in Gwangju in the 1980s and the student movement for Palestine today, here in the axis of the empire. The Gwangju Uprising, in which students and workers rose against the brutal military dictatorship, was a flashpoint in Korea's long struggle for democracy and sovereignty. The students of Gwangju, much like those advocating for Palestine today, refused to remain passive, knowing the fight for freedom and liberation was a risk they were willing to take. And like the fascist American government now, the fascist South Korean government violently repressed the student movement, attempting to silence and strategically eliminate any forms of dissent. In this moment, we are reminded that the fight for Palestinian liberation is not just a political struggle, it is a moral imperative. We understand that police response is a sign of the university's weakness. We know that the establishment's effort to arrest us, suspend us, and expel us is a sign of their weakness. Tactics to obliterate our rights to dissent against the settler carceral state in the institutions we attend are a sign of their weakness. Their delusions will be dismantled, their punitive strategies only prove that we are winning, and we are witnessing the last days of the empire. We condemn the universities and colleges that we attend, Penn, UCLA, UC Berkeley, Reed College, along with all the universities we have been seeing on the news, such as Columbia, CUNY, the Claremont Colleges, NYU, and many more, MIT recently, for choosing complicity and genocide over the safety of their students and the basic dignity of humanity. So as long as these universities and institutions uphold the violence of the empire, we as students will continue to belligerently resist by all means necessary.
That's right.
And like we said in the very beginning of our awesome chants, hands off our students, hands off Palestine, and US out of Korea, US out of everywhere, US out of the Philippines, and free Palestine until liberation and return.
Thank you both for your moving testimonies and for reminding us that the Korean War is not just a historical chapter that has ended already, and actually it's an ongoing war today.
Right.
Millions of Koreans are still separated from their families by the DMZ line. Millions of Koreans are living with threats of constant bomb raids and violence from US imperialism. And this is happening across Asia as well. So thank you again for joining us. And the reason why we're holding this panel today is because we really want to, together with everyone, understand what is the ongoing crisis in Asia right now, and why it is more pertinent than ever to build this coalition of people fighting against war and imperialism. We want this to be an interactive panel, so we consider everyone in this room an expert in some way or another, whether it's you being an expert in your own community, sharing food and languages with people that you know, that allow us insights into like different communities here. You might be a union representative and have more of a labor analysis on capitalism and imperialism. You might be a community organizer doing work against like anti-police brutality that see a lot of these weaponry and military trainings being exercised here in your communities. You might be student organizers fighting against gentrification and displacement by the same university that you attend. Everyone here has something that they can contribute to this discussion, and we want to encourage that and want everyone to feel comfortable in raising your hands, asking questions, and making any type of statements that feel important to you. That being said, we do want to introduce our panelists today. We are joined by KT from Bayan-USA. And KT is an organizer again with the Alliance of Progressive Filipino Organizations Against U.S. Imperialism, Feudalism, and Bureaucrat Capitalism. Its organizers seek to realize national democracy and liberation for the Philippines. We also welcome Dr. Nazia Kazi here. Who is an anthropologist, educator, and author of Islamophobia, Race, and Global Politics. Her work explores the role of Islamophobia and racism in the context of global politics. We would also like to welcome Putterman. Who is a writer, educator, and historian of Asian American community politics, U.S. empire, and social movements. And these are the panelists that will be moving along the discussion today and will be guiding us. But like I said, everyone please feel free to contribute.
All right, so we're gonna get started. This is the final housekeeping thing. So we're gonna allow the panelists to answer the questions first, and then after each slide, we'll pause. And if anyone from the audience wants to share a comment, thought, question, feel free to. We're gonna stick to about 5 minutes for the audience, just because we wanna stay on time. Okay, so the first slide here, framing U.S. imperialism in the Asia Pacific. For our first question, for any of the panelists to answer, how would you characterize U.S. imperialism in the Asia Pacific in today's context? And what methods do the ruling class use to sustain U.S. imperial dominance in the Asia Pacific?
I can give it a start. I think when we talk about U.S. imperialism in Asia and the Pacific today, it's useful to see how empire is defining itself in its own words, often very explicitly. And so, the guiding rubric for U.S. policy in Asia and the Pacific for the past 7-8 years has been what is called, quote unquote, the free and open Indo-Pacific. This is the bipartisan strategy that has been shared by the Trump, Biden, and second Trump administrations. And basically, this notion of the Indo-Pacific and the language of a free and open Indo-Pacific is pretty new for the U.S. It was in 2018 that under Trump, there was a document released called the U.S. Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific. And this document pretty explicitly defines what the U.S. interest in this region is, and it calls for strategies that will maintain quote-unquote diplomatic, economic, and military preeminence in a region that Indo-PACOM, which is now kind of the Army Command Center that oversees the Indo-Pacific. This is a territory that spans on the eastern front, the coast just off of California, all the way westward across the Pacific into continental Asia. Its western boundary is India. So this is a territory that encompasses about half of the Earth's surface, more than half of the Earth's population, and this is a territory that the U.S. explicitly and openly is defining as needing to be maintained under U.S. preeminence across the spectrum of economics, diplomacy, and military. So I think that's kind of a starting point for thinking about U.S. strategy in this region. And I think, even though this is emerging in 2018, it draws on a much longer discourse that really has defined the U.S. since its inception, that has sought to, first in the 19th century, really establish itself as a formal, mature Western imperial power vis-a-vis its domination of Asia and the Pacific. And more recently, I think we can trace this specifically to the Obama administration during a moment in which the U.S. ostensibly was trying to wind down its commitments in the Middle East in order to, the terminology was this pivot to Asia, to pivot both U.S. military capacity and economic kind of influence to this Indo-Pacific region. So this is a bipartisan strategy that continues to unfold under the current administration.
Yeah, I think you paint the picture well as far as like half the globe. That's half the globe. And so, any sort of state that is seeking to gain and sustain its power is going to look to the Asia-Pacific region to uphold like their political, economic, military power. Have some statistics, which is why I wanted to even paint that picture more, is like 42% of global investments are in the Asia-Pacific, 41% of global exports are there, 36.8% of global imports are transported along 60% of the world's maritime shipping routes in the Asia-Pacific region, right? And it's home to 40% of the world's migrants from, the Asia-Pacific region. And so all of that is so central to holding state power. And some of the ways that the U.S. relies and continues to maintain their strategies, it's through appropriating the command structures of allied and subaltern states, like the Philippines, for example, to be aligned by their military strategies. So there's these military agreements that have been installed, even though the Philippines was granted independence by the U.S. In 1945 or 45. But it was on July 4th, so that the U.S. and the Philippines could share the same Independence Day. They call it U.S. Friendship Day now. Give it a boo. Sorry about that. But we actually celebrate Independence Day on June 12th, just the one where we actually fought off Spanish colonization. Even just the reverting back, and we try to even poke more. It's are we actually even free and independent? We're coming up on June 12th as well, and we're going to be doing our own protest actions. We'll talk about that later. But, there are these military agreements signed between the U.S. and the Philippines, even though the U.S. is not allowed to have military bases there anymore. Post-independence, but it creates a legal framework to, oh, thank you so much. Of course. Appreciate it. Looking out for the speakers. But yeah, a legal framework to appropriate these military structures in countries outside of the US to fight these sort of proxy wars. And so yeah, gives access to territories in the Asia Pacific, access to military bases. It's a public display of joint military exercises on, China, Russia, other competing powers to the US. And it becomes a reliable market for weapons sales. And yeah, there's nothing equal about these agreements, for sure.
So I don't really have anything to say about the Asia Pacific context specifically, but the question of capital accumulation and militarism, I think, is really interesting to have right now, because this long-held assumption that war is a racket has never been more patently obvious, I think, than in the last 19 months. So if we're talking, for instance, about the student uprising, I think that one of the things this movement on campuses has done especially well is just reveal how clearly the U.S. Department of Defense is a money-making operation. That the crises that face the world also produce the largest transfers of wealth upward, and that's why these calls to boycott and divest are especially powerful. But if you ever read the Military Times, which is very depressing, don't do it. But they're really upset about the Reaper drones that are being that were downed by Yemen. Each of them, $30 to $50 million each. And this is really advanced weaponry, brought down by really rudimentary weaponry, which that's actually an advantage for Yemen. That their weapons, if they happen to lose some weaponry, it was like cheap and old to begin with. Whereas every time the U.S. loses a Reaper drone, it's $30 million setback, and now it's close to $750 million of loss for the U.S. Wow. Of course, though, when you study economics and you learn about the concept of an externality, which is that for private industry, it's in their interest to make sure that the negative costs are paid for by someone else. So like Monsanto is not going to pay your medical bills.
Right.
So, for Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Boeing, this is not a crisis. The Reaper drones getting shot down is not a crisis. It's a remarkable opportunity, and it's actually an advantage to them. So it's actually to their benefit to have this kind of negative externality where the US taxpayer is just going to keep shoveling money to this apparatus. So you may have heard that Donald Trump is proposing this Golden Dome, which is modeled based on Israel's Iron Dome, which the US gave Israel to begin with, right? So now they want to have a Golden Dome that's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars built over a few years that is completely unnecessary because nobody is firing missiles at the US. Nobody is going to fire missiles at the US because the U.S. is the one with the military bases all around the world, like close to 1,000 military bases around the world. And the only reason the U.S. has military bases around the world is because constructing a base means you have to do less diplomacy. So you have to negotiate less because you already have this menacing force. I mean, some of these military bases are, the military base at Guantanamo Bay is the size of Washington, D.C. Wow. It's not like a building. There are some that are buildings. There are like those small lily pad bases, they call them. And then there are the ones that are these sprawling metropolises with their own McDonald's and their own shopping malls. So the U.S. has this whole base empire around the world. We don't need this Golden Dome. But it is a boondoggle. It is a way to make money and transfer wealth upwards. And I think that's what I would say about the question of capital accumulation in militarism.
I really appreciate the panelists sharing such a diverse view of how U.S. imperialism shows up, whether it's through soft words like friendship and promise to democracy, which we know that's not really the case, or even in the way these expensive drones and bases are being funded with where's that money coming from really, right? It's the Department of Defense, it's government, right? So it's like we can't, as working people, fall for these narratives, whether we're abroad or here, that the ruling class is just moving money around for our betterment, right? That's obviously not the case, so thank you all for sharing that. All right, so the second question here, how does the US use alliances to extend the logic of NATO into the Asia Pacific? What are the long-term implications for national sovereignty and anti-imperialist resistance?
So first of all, I can say I work in academia, right? And I think if you were to talk to like most of the political scientists and global studies faculty members and researchers that I come across and were to ask them what NATO is, they would be like, oh, it's like a peacekeeping force. Like they would recite the and they're not doing it because they're like evil counterinsurgents. They're doing it, and I say this seriously, from stupidity, which is like a very important tool in Empire's toolkit. You know, and you guys remember, like in April, when they had all these hands-off rallies, which called for some really good things like hands-off Social Security and stuff, they were also saying hands-off NATO.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so like hands-off Medicare and Medicaid, hands-off NATO. And it is just banking on this assumption that everyone from, you know, the writers of the New York Times down to your poli-sci professors at your local college don't actually know that NATO destroyed Libya. Or that, you know, I mean, NATO's whole raison d'etre, its whole thing is alienating its non-members.
Right.
That's like what it does.
Right.
So it's inherently hostile to its non-members, which helps us make sense of what happened in Russia and Ukraine. But then you have these eager kind of puppet governments of the U.S. who want in. So I think it was in early 2024, perhaps, that NATO opened like a liaison office in Jordan. And so Jordan is in a really interesting position because they have absorbed a huge number of Palestinian refugees over decades. And these are people with politics, you know, with resistance and revolutionary goals that are now part of Jordan. And then the Jordanian king is like a puppet of the US, and he allows airspace to carry out the genocide, like all kinds of things. But NATO is an interesting force in the Middle East. I don't think we would have seen the Syrian government toppled without Turkey in December. And Turkey is a NATO member. And Turkey, you know, I study anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. And one of the really interesting things I've noticed here in the US is pro-Turkish sentiment entering Sunni Muslim spaces. Mosques in the US, there's like these Turkish-sponsored Diyanet masjids that a lot of Muslims will go visit as part of their Muslim Student Association field trips, or their mosque, you know, partners with or whatever. And there's this kind of tipping toward Turkey that's happening now that mirrors the way a lot of Muslim America was oriented towards Saudi Arabia in the 80s and 90s. And I think it's worth paying attention to. It's really interesting to see how Muslim Americans' religious subjectivities are also a tool for empire.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I love the specificity of just what everybody brings on this panel too. And I was like, just thinking about even like the Philippines' participation in CEDAW. If people know of that, it's a Southeast Asian treaty organization, like a copycat NATO, but into Asia. And this was, you know, like leading the US-led war in Europe. The US partnered with UK and France, which were the former Pacific colonial powers, right, with Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, to bring Thailand and Pakistan into CEDAW. However, even though that was started in 1955, it disbanded in 1977 due to the disgrace of the US. Okay. And aggressive allies who were defeated by successful national liberation struggles of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And that's like, to think about how do we undo these, like, all of these countries that are getting together to form these powerful alliances in such like great masses in the world. It's like, it's going to be the mass people's movement that's going to take it down little by little, right?
That's right.
And so, you know, even though the dismantlement of CETO had happened, it still led to the US establishing bilateral, multilateral agreements within the Asia-Pacific region. So US making military agreements deals that I was talking about with the Philippines, and then also the quadrilateral dialogue and AUKUS between Australia, UK, US. As these attempts for the US to continue to make strategic gains and counter China again. But NATO declares China and Russia the enemies of the world, but again, it's about building the people's movement, even in the diasporic Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian movement, and building those ties, especially with anti-militarism, and really seeing even if it feels so disparate or far apart, or I know so many NHPI youth are wanting to reconnect to their culture because it is on the other side of the world truly, but there are people here in the US are also fighting they want those wars to end too, and we have to make that connect. That is a part of our cultural stewardship and retention is getting US out of Asia. US fall is inevitable, people's resistance has always been present historically, and just US out of everywhere.
I think that you two have already kind of touched on this. I want to say it explicitly, and maybe it's kind of obvious, but the thing that enables these treaties and military arrangements to be defined as defensive is a boogeyman, is an aggressor. And obviously historically with NATO, it was the Soviet Union and now Russia. What we're seeing in terms of, over the past 5-6 years, there have been all these different new strategic partnerships that the United States is trying to forge in Asia Pacific. Some of them have really ridiculous names. There was AUKUS, which was Australia, UK, United States. There's the Quad, which was the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, I believe. And more recently under Biden, there was this trilateral security alliance with Japan and Korea. The explicit kind of rhetorical justification for all of these defense arrangements is China, and to a lesser extent the DPRK in the case of the Korean Peninsula. So I think it's important just to name that, when we talk about the way that the military-industrial complex is profiting from, the transfer of arms and military buildups in Asian Pacific, this is a political economy that is enabled by xenophobia in the context of this new Cold War against China, and even as kind of national security hawks talk about Russia, talk about Iran, they'll jump between different kind of regional threats. The ultimate consensus within the U.S. national security apparatus is that China is the only what they call peer competitor to the United States. China is the only power capable of challenging U.S. hegemony across all domains. And I think that construction of China as an aggressor is part of what enables this kind of what seems to be a crazy liberal defense of NATO as something that is, worthy of defense, is democratic, is something that, the quote-unquote resistance should be defending. I think is this construction of a boogeyman.
Yeah, really, really great points again. Just want to point out that the little blip earlier was KT's fire that they're bringing to the but no, we're at war. This is the ruling class drawing lines, and some are more explicit, but a lot of these lines that are being drawn, whether they're through agreements or through infiltration, with Turkish NATO-backed masjids or what have you, they're drawing lines to prepare empire versus the rest of us, right? That's really what's happening and what's coming. So we, as people here, and as people of conscience, as people who care about peace and not war, life and not death, we need to figure out where we fall in that equation, right? It's a choice, and it's also our duty to bring our loved ones, our communities together along for the ride. So with that, I think we can move on to the next slide, or actually, audience. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share, comments, questions for the panel, or anything else? Toy.
So I wanted to talk more on the boogeyman that you mentioned. I think in the case with China, I was wondering what your thoughts were on how the U.S. ruling class to construct this sort of enemy image of China, especially when we've been seeing through social media broader access to like what the Chinese people really are, as well as the current administration's very blatant attacks on like Chinese students and immigrants on our community, which seems almost like unwarranted and very much one-sided on their end. So again, just like what are your thoughts on how they will actually construct that boogeyman?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, as you point out, I think that this construction of China as a boogeyman, as this authoritarian threat, is being challenged in a lot of ways by increased kind of connections between Americans, everyday Americans, and everyday Chinese people in social media spaces like Red Note and TikTok. There's an increasing, I think, visibility and opportunity for conversations that are not mediated by U.S. media, U.S. national security state, that are starting to chip away at this construction. But at the same time, I think this construction of China as a boogeyman has very deep historical roots. Even if we might define this as a new Cold War, we should remember that the first Cold War also was very much triangulated, not just vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but also China. That the U.S. was fighting Chinese troops on the ground in Korea, as well as to a lesser extent in Vietnam. That China for many, many decades was seen as kind of this communist evil that was akin to all of the socialization and demonization around the Soviet Union that was happening in Cold War American culture. And so I think there's an entrenchment of these kinds of narratives that there are new opportunities to chip away at, and I think cultural diplomacy, informal diplomacy, even just sharing space online can chip away at this idea that like China is this black box, that like we can't trust anything that we hear out of China. We saw this so much during COVID. Everything coming from China is a lie. We can't trust anything about the number of COVID deaths, the nature of COVID's origins, their vaccine, like all of this notion that everything out of China has to be read through this filter of like censorship, silencing of dissidents, etc. The ability in a place like Red Note, it's kind of like very simple, and in some cases not overtly political, but just being able to talk to Chinese people in a person-to-person way, I think does a lot to chip away at some of these discourses that many of us have grown up with, have lived through for many decades.
All right, thanks for that. Just for the sake of time, sorry Nancy, we're a little bit behind schedule, so we're gonna actually keep it moving. We'll save it for the end.
Thank you to our panelists for really defining what U.S. imperialism is looking like today in the Asia Pacific, and why Asia is like this extremely strategic area for capital accumulation, because of its large labor reserves and the way that capital is able to be exported there. Why it's strategic for empire to have low-cost manufacturing hubs be stationed in Asia, because of unequal development that's happening across the economy, or like the Asian economies, due to centuries of colonialism, right? And also because Asia is rich in natural resources as well. And how it's using these alliances as essentially a tool to drive capitalism and to project its own power over Asia in what Mark said is this ultimate battle or war against communism, against China. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to militarism and occupation. And I'm going to actually ask these questions all together, and the panelists can take a stab at whatever one they want to answer. So what is the current strategy of U.S. imperialism across Asia, including West Asia, or the Middle East, Palestine, East Asia, like Korea, and Southeast Asia, like the Philippines? What connects these theaters of military activity under U.S. foreign policy today? And what does the expansion of U.S. military bases in Korea and the Philippines say about America's role in the larger Asia-Pacific containment strategy? And how does the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the Israeli occupation of Palestine serve as a model for militarized urban control and settler colonialism globally? what lessons from the West Bank or Gaza are exported here in the US?
I'll talk a little bit about this last question about what reverberates and kind of this question of the imperial boomerang. I think we've probably all been hearing this a great deal, that some of the horrors we're witnessing are just gonna come right back home, and we've seen many of them come right back home. I also think there's a kind of mysticism in some of these comments, and like sometimes I hear people talk about how, your grandkids are going to ask you what you were doing in 2023 or 2024, or like history is going to judge you, as if history is not written and codified by the ruling class. Nobody's out there right now getting shamed by history for not having said something about the US's role in Latin America during the Dirty Wars. It's forgotten, it's erased. It's up to us to correct the narrative and do it as loudly and repeatedly as possible so that history can shame the people who deserve to be shamed. So having said that, we do see that what happens domestically echoes what's happening abroad. Most obviously, we can see the relationship between militarism and policing, that we can draw lines between, Cop City and the military-industrial complex. But really, I think we have to be attentive to the ways that we're living in the post-9/11, we're living in the aftermath of the War on Terror, which drastically changed these connections. So I'm reminded of when, it must have been 2012 or something, when it was revealed that there was a black site at Homan Square in Chicago. And a black site is basically a secret prison that's off the books, where you can be interrogated, detained, nobody knows, there's no paper trail of it, there's no due process. And of course this came a decade after the CIA built a whole global archipelago of black sites around the world as part of Bush's, war on terror. And that came right back home. And it wasn't until there was, I think it was actually an anti-NATO protest that happened in Chicago that some people were taken to that black site in Homan Square, where ordinarily it was, drug dealers and people who didn't have legal resources to reveal what was happening at Homan Square. It took this kind of anti-imperialist demonstration for people to be like, there's a black site in Chicago. And if you know Muslim and Arab Americans, then you know people that have been interrogated after 9/11, since 9/11, and that stuff really never stopped. It just kind of comes and goes in tandem with whatever the politics of the day are. That often these interrogations happen in office buildings. You wonder what happened when all these office buildings during COVID, the offices shut down, people went to remote work. A bunch of them were actually used by the state for interrogation and detention stuff. So I personally know enough people who have been taken to a random office building in Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and been, interrogated by the FBI for 9 hours. So these echoes are very, very clear. And I think the proliferation of counterterrorism companies is worth looking at. So these counterterrorism companies, things like Tiger Swan is one that probably some of you have heard of. They were ostensibly designed to protect and fight against the Muslim terror threat after 9/11. But it was Tiger Swan, a counterterrorism firm, that was called at Standing Rock to, put tear gas on the indigenous protesters there. So it's just very obvious how what happened in the early days of the War on Terror continues now. Certainly the militarization of the border, US-Mexico border, is one of those. And again, back to military times, it's really funny to see these internecine squabbles between various branches of empire, because the Department of Defense is really angry at the Department of Homeland Security for using their military resources at the border when they want to use them, against Iran and China. It's no, you're using our stuff at the border, and it's there's actual anxiety between both of these departments about the other and this resource competition, which is something for us to pay attention to. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I made note of like even Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, like recently gave 500. But you know, like promising $500 million to the for Philippine defense, and of course that's going into counterinsurgency efforts as well, quote unquote defense. Like we said before, what are military agreements? They're forms of aggression and occupation. But you know, right, like the current strategy, why they're here is the extraction of resources. Again, like, you know, that's funny to hear about, like, right, this anxiety between, like, the border versus abroad, but it's just like, but we're all trying to, like, extract, and, like, now it's, like, this this internal fight to be like, how are we going to extract, and what's the best way to? But anyway, with that aside, I was just thinking about also, like, the occupation in the Philippines is, yes, like, of course, to deprive people of their land, to displace them, to be able to extract and exploit the export for their gain, and then it's also a geopolitical outpost in the Asia Pacific. The ways that there are already all these military agreements, a former colony into neo-colony, and like the way that so much of the current government republic of the Philippines sides with U.S. Policies and interests. It's like, yeah, of course, these are military bases. It's a 5-hour flight away from China and Japan. It's a 4-hour flight to the DPRK. It's less than 3 hours to Hong Kong. So like if they're constantly stationed there, that's going to be that much easier for war provocations to escalate and to, yeah, send us into another world war. And so one of the strategies that we've been currently fighting against through the U.S. Out of the Philippines campaign with Bayan-USA is around the recent joint military exercises that happen annually, such as, they're called Salaknib, which translates to shield, and Balikatan, which is like shoulder-to-shoulder exercises. So it's like also co-opting collectivist, mutual language for war, which is like so, and it's our words, like it's our words. And what they're doing together is like hand-to-hand combat, live firing, operating aircrafts, and it's done every year like a holiday, and it's a performance of mutual and equal relationships with the Philippines. But honestly, these exercises would never happen on U.S. soil. It has to happen in the Philippines, right? And its proximity to, again, to China being like this other power competing with the U.S., is that it's going to escalate, you know, like just flexing on China, their military strength out in the Asia Pacific. And Mark had already talked a little bit about the Indo-Pacific economic framework, but then there's also this first island chain that's being built across the archipelagos of Japan, Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, North Philippines, and Borneo facing East Asia. So it's like creating this encirclement to China as well, and readying themselves like at any moment, like honestly, like with the tensions that we can just like feel in the air, it's like I feel like this panel could be over and we'll like be thrust into it. But you know what I mean? It's just like these military exercises every year. It's like, and it's honestly, it's the surrounding communities that pay the consequences too. There's this, we're going to talk about it a little bit later with the promotional stuff, but like there's a documentary that Bayan-USA is putting out in different installments. And one of them is like featuring interviews with the surrounding communities of these bases in the Philippines that U.S. military has access to. And they're talking about, they don't know what's going on. They're not getting a heads up about like these live firings happening. They think they're already at war. And they're like reforesting their communities, right? And like they're having to stop. So thinking about even just the cycle of underdevelopment in the Asia Pacific region, the Philippines specifically, for those indigenous communities.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the first island and second island chain. That I think it speaks to the way that for the U.S., like, you know, as much as U.S. politicians talk about our borders and national sovereignty and defending our borders, when the U.S. is looking at a map of Asia and the Pacific, they're not seeing sovereign countries. They're seeing dots on a map that can be bases for U.S. forces. And so, you know, these struggles are connected because the United States is quite explicitly linking these islands and nations into a web of containment. And so these struggles are intimately linked because U.S. regional strategy is to not only like play nations off of one another, but also to unite them into defensive arrangements, into you know, military partners. And I think, you know, when we talk about occupation and militarism in Asia and the Pacific, I also want to just mention the explicit settler colonialism of places like Hawaii and Guam that theoretically have been incorporated into the United States, but really are captive sovereign nations that, again, were explicitly colonized because they were seen as useful stepping stones. That was the language. Hawaii and Guam would be stepping stones to East and Southeast Asia for the US empire. And we continue to see the intense militarization of a place like Hawaii, which every 2 years hosts another war games known as the Rim of the Pacific exercises, which bring together 20 plus US allies for these quote unquote war games in Hawaii. And so I think part of this network, this empire of bases and this network of colonization is settler colonialism that happens within the technical territorial boundaries of the United States itself.
Thank you for that. And for the sake of time, we're just going to move very quickly through this slide, the technology, surveillance, and industry. We're going to ask panelists to keep their comments short so that we can go through the rest of the presentation. But we do want to cover it because we think it's important to. So what role do tech corporations and arms manufacturers play in shaping U.S. military policy in Asia? And it's also a well-known fact that the Zionist regime tests repressive surveillance of military technologies on Palestinians, for example, biometric surveillance, drone warfare, and AI-powered targeting software before this tech is used to repress people's movement globally. And so to what extent are these technologies being deployed in places like the Philippines and Korea? And additionally, what is the role of high-tech surveillance in criminalizing Asian American organizers here that are protesting and engaging in solidarity and socialist work?
I can briefly start to talk a little bit about the first and maybe third question. When it comes to technology, and this was mentioned in kind of the framing of our political moment, the issue of automation. I think there's a really critical way in which AI is becoming increasingly weaponized and incorporated into this new Cold War and the broader kind of imperial apparatus. And I think there's a very complicated dynamic right now where I think that the U.S. is, in order to prevent what they see as the threat of China dominating the AI field, essentially merging kind of defense and technology policy, which has a long history. But I think when we talk about what is the profit motive and profit structure of imperialism, one way that that's happening right now in the world of technology is that the U.S. I think actually just earlier this month, the Trump administration put forward these new AI export controls that essentially would wield secondary sanctions against any country that uses certain Chinese AI products. And so this is a means of the U.S. really blocking out China from entire markets in Europe, in Southeast Asia, across the developing world by wielding the language of national security, by wielding the structure of U.S. sanctions, as part of this play to ensure U.S. dominance over what is increasingly seen as kind of the key industry for capitalism in the 21st century.
We would have to move on.
I don't really have anything to add on this point, so I'm eager to.
No, I don't
Okay.
agree. Unless there's anything else in the other questions of the AI.
We can move on.
All right, so this is our final set of questions here, ideological division and narrative control. So what are some common narratives about the Philippines, Korea, Palestine, and other Asian countries peddled by U.S. empire? What are the ideological ties that bind the U.S.-Israel relationship to broader patterns of U.S. militarization in Asia? And how is Palestine's struggle connected to militarization elsewhere in Asia? From the Korean and Vietnam Wars to the current Cold War rhetoric against China, How has U.S. imperialism in Asia fueled racialized violence, surveillance, and scapegoating of Asian American communities?
So yeah, a lot. I guess thinking about the common narratives, especially with the introductions to this panel of being like, defying these stereotypes placed upon us as Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian peoples, and you know, especially with the Philippines being one of the conquests, long-standing conquests of the U.S., seen as a little brown brother to the U.S., and that continues to side with the U.S. on any major foreign policy. The U.S. and the Philippines invests a lot in shifting public opinion against China, especially with the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea, you know, struggle right now. But in actuality, you know, like the Filipino people are getting caught in the middle of these war provocations with U.S. and China. And that encroachment can't be denied either, like fisher folk that are fishing in the upper waters of like northern Philippines are being attacked by like Chinese naval warfare as well. So that's like also hard to, you know, try to reckon with when we're trying to instill a sense of like Philippine sovereignty to the Filipinos that we're organizing who might side with the U.S. It's like we're not asking you to side with China either. It's like we want you to assert like become sovereign, like become your own, like have your own like people's military force, right? Because that's what we've done historically too against Spain, against Japan during those times of colonization and imperialism. But yeah, ultimately like the Philippines is seen as like a source of cheap labor and again, natural resources for U.S. empire. And the U.S. benefits from the labor export policy in the Philippines that brokers and facilitates the export of people, pretty much people's labor, through what we call overseas Filipino workers, OFWs, across the globe. And so that's why the Philippine diaspora is so huge, is because there are all these domestic care workers, nurses, who are providing that sort of that labor and care worldwide. And so these sort of stereotypes of labor, they conflate with subservience, being good workers, and it sets them up for exploitation and oppression, and they're neglected and willfully abandoned by their bosses in the Philippine state, and that enables labor trafficking. And so these narratives of passivity are not only dangerous, but they're false, because Philippines have always resisted domination. And so that's why, you know, I just like really appreciate just like also this, the framing of this panel, because we have to aspire for more and build this sort of resistance, of the spirit to fight, and not feel so intimidated because of maybe like how we should behave in certain spaces.
That's right. I guess I'll share a few comments about normalization with regard to Israel. And so obviously we most commonly hear this with regards to states normalizing ties. So the 2020 Abraham Accords between the Gulf states and Israel are a prime example of that. But I guess I want to connect normalization to the question of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, or I guess Islam in the US, Muslims in the US. So a lot of the key architects of the Abraham Accords, specifically from the United Arab Emirates, have played a role in training Western Muslim religious leaders, who then come back to the US and teach this version of Islam that has urged normalization, often using religious language. So to say, well, yes, we should sit down and, you know, dialogue with Zionists, and even the Prophet Muhammad spoke with his enemies, or, you know, using these kinds of theological arguments. It's really interesting, and I find the history really troubling. Some of you may have heard of MLI, which is the Muslim Leadership Initiative, and it's a project of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And basically what they did for a long time was take Muslim American leaders on these really lavish junkets to Israel, to visit and explore, and then come back and tell Muslim Americans, you know, how, you know, we just need kind of interfaith dialogue and understanding, and, you know, it's complicated and these kinds of things, and basically squash the kernels of politics that were really popping up around the occupation. I think that's really interesting. I mean, it was the summer of 2014 when Operation Protective Edge was happening in Gaza. this is when Palestinians had turned their ice cream freezers into morgues for children, right? And Barack Obama decided to have a Ramadan dinner, an iftar, at the White House during this. And there was this whole thing about this boycott that did not happen. Some people chose to boycott it. Some people went anyway, and again, using that language of normalization, using the language of isn't dialogue good, isn't that what we should be doing, isn't that how we get legitimacy, etc. Then it happened again last summer, but that was Eric Adams' New York City iftar. And that was in the middle of this genocide, right? And it was so grotesque, and there were these calls for boycott, and people still went. And a few months ago, I had a very tearful student in my office who showed me that out in Atlantic County, where I work, there was an ADL-sponsored iftar. Okay, the ADL was sponsoring an iftar for local Muslim groups, and it was just very interesting, the dialogues that emerged around this that reflected this, like, so we see like normalization on the state level, and then we see how Muslim identity and, you know, Muslim leaders in particular are co-opted in certain ways to then, there's a guy named Hamza Yusuf, who some people call him Hamza Useless. He's like a white Muslim convert who is probably the most famous Muslim American. He's the biggest leader. He commands huge audiences. If Hamza Yusuf is speaking at an Islamic community fundraiser, and you can charge $1,000 a plate to get in there. I mean, he's a big deal. He's just been appointed an advisor to the Trump administration. He also consulted with George W. Bush on a name change for the Iraq invasion. He said, don't call it Operation Iraqi Liberation because that spells out oil. Here's what you should call it. Now go invade, happy invading. Now, so he's just been named this figure in the Trump administration, and there's all this dialogue happening in Muslim American spaces, like, no, he's our sheikh, he's been our leader for so long, we have to trust, he's playing four-dimensional chess, he knows what he's doing. And then other people who were like, well, screw this guy. But he was trained by religious leaders who were also responsible for the Abraham Accords. Okay, so the politics around this are just so troubling and enduring. I mean, I thought really once we saw some of the most grotesque things happening in the last year and a half that some of this stuff would wither, but really those moves to like co-opt Muslim American leaders remain. And I think it was your question earlier about how an enemy could be produced in a war like overnight, and I think one of the things we can't underestimate is how well empire can do that and like produce an enemy. Like, I think if the US needed to go to war with Iran next week, it could get every American terrified of Iran in 5 days. Like, really could. And I think, whether that needs to be China, Iran, Russia, whatever it needs to be, those things have been really fine-tuned. And I think a lot of it has to do with how the national security apparatus is so embedded on every level of culture, whether it's reviewing films. There's a great book called National Security Cinema, which documents literally how every single movie is vetted by either the Pentagon or the CIA. It's just, I think that, and my point in saying that is the Muslim enemy can just be like used as is convenient in certain ways, as is the Muslim ally. There is no Islamophobia when it comes to Donald Trump hanging out with the Saudi royal family. He's perfectly fine to go put a hand on an orb or like whatever, or maybe some of you saw like the women in the UAE doing their like hair swooshing for Donald Trump's procession down the aisle. So I think like the Muslim boogeyman kind of sits in reserve in a really interesting way. There was this book written in 1973 called The Arab Mind by a guy named Raphael Patai, who basically says, like, this is 1973, so there's a lot happening in the region at this point that involves the US, and this book is written, and it becomes very popular, and it just talks about how the desert heat has, like, cooked the Muslim brain, made us, inordinately violent, very sex and masturbation obsessed, and it was this book that was very popularly read for those few years and then forgotten about. And then in 2003, it became required reading again for like a certain rank and up in the US military at the time of the invasion of Iraq. So you can create these boogeymen really easily. The US is primed to accept the boogeyman that is presented to them. And I think that's one of the really brilliant and terrifying features of American militarism.
Just to speak a little bit to this last question about Asian America, I think that when it comes to U.S. empire, Asian Americans are in a very contradictory position in which, historically Asian Americans have been, on the one hand, at the forefront of kind of anti-imperialist, anti-war movements, and in support of national liberation and anti-colonial projects in our countries of ancestry. And at the same time, we have also been mobilized quite successfully by the United States as kind of symbols of multicultural empire. And I think that, even in this Trump moment when a lot of the tenets of anti-racism are being dispatched with, I think the function of multicultural empire, particularly when it comes to Asian Americans, is still in operation. And this, has a long history, I think. The way in which Asian Americans during the Cold War were mobilized as, symbols of inclusion to fight against kind of communist allegations that the U.S. is this racist nation. Asian Americans were held up as evidence that, actually things are great here. And this occurred through a number of different fronts. Hawaii statehood was, because Hawaii had the largest Asian American population, Hawaii statehood was celebrated not as, this consolidation of colonialism, but instead this symbol of Asian American incorporation and ascendance, and was described by, I believe, Hiram Fong, who was the first Chinese American senator from Hawaii, also a Republican. He described Hawaiian statehood as doing more for Asia than what the Marshall Plan did for Europe. And so this is, and he added at no cost. This is not billions of dollars of US aid, this is symbolism. This kind of racial symbolism has long been understood as really, really core to the way that the US constructs itself as a nation and as an empire. And so I think that the challenge for kind of Asian American organizers in this moment is to push up against these very entrenched kind of ideologies and structures that have been designed to essentially cordon our politics from liberatory politics in our countries of ancestry. There's a huge kind of educational pipeline, career pipeline, material incentive for Asian Americans, like many other kind of minority groups, to become native informants, to write op-eds in the New York Times about authoritarianism in China, to write, to work for think tanks, to mobilize in a very violent way, like our language skills, our cultural competency, to use for the United States empire. And so I think, particularly since COVID, as there's been all this conversation about, quote unquote anti-Asian hate, there's been, on the one hand, I think really important radical leftist anti-imperialist connections drawn to, U.S. imperialism, xenophobia, the new Cold War, that has worked against this kind of institutionalization of anti-racism as a project that, instead of challenging U.S. empire, actually ends up entrenching it.
Really brilliant analysis. Let's give them a hand. Thank you so much. The education, the details, the analysis is just, again, top notch, and we can't be understated that these are the things that we should be taking away from this room today and bringing back to our communities. Knowledge is power, right? Educating people on what the truth is as opposed to what the U.S. propaganda machine is pumping out. So we're going to open up now for about 5 minutes of questions from the audience. If we don't fill the 5 minutes, that's okay. So we'll kick off with, I think Nancy was on stack initially, if you want to go ahead. Yeah, and then we'll go.
I was just thinking about this new move of the Trump administration to either block or deport Chinese students from universities, and how the ruling class is kind of split about this, right? The MAGA people love it, but then the Silicon Valley folks are but wait, this is, you need these highly skilled workers, and how that's a big division. Is that a division that we can help exploit in the ruling class? And kind of how that, I don't know if it mirrors, but it's also I was just thinking about like my coworkers, you know, it's like the older coworkers are like, yeah, China is so evil, like we gotta, you know, they're all ready for the war, and then my younger coworkers are like, I love TikTok, I love China, it's so cool, you know, it's just anyway, how to navigate these things as trying to build solidarity, you know, within our own class.
Yeah, I guess I would say that this definitely, I think, is a fissure within the ruling class. And I would describe it as kind of a conflict over whether U.S. capitalist imperialism is to function as like more of an exclusionary project or more of an inclusive project. So like, are we going to blanket ban Chinese students from coming to study at American universities? Or are we going to try to incorporate them into this project of American liberalism, et cetera? And I mean, there's a very long history that, you know, in the early 1900s, some of the first Chinese students to come to the United States were sponsored by government funds that had the intention of, you know, educating the best minds of China in order to send them back and basically carry out U.S. interests as proxies. And so I think there is kind of a liberal attachment still to that kind of vision. That, you know, while on the surface is opposing some of the most kind of exclusionary rhetoric and policy from the Trump administration, is still very invested in this ideological project of U.S. empire. And so, you know, I'm less clear about how to exploit that divide, because neither one is very kind of beneficial for the kind of movements that we're building. And so I think it is a kind of it's a contradiction to track and to think about ways to intervene.
All right, I think we had Stephen, Max, Claire, Timur.
Yeah, kind of more of like an ode to you all than a question, I guess, but it's like, I just really appreciate that you did such a good job of historical reasoning and specifying who the enemy is, and I think, you know, I'm like very much like among the people in my life, and so I hear kind of funny stuff all the time, but it's like, it's always been captivating, I mean, just astonishing to me that you can tell any racist lie about any Eastern leader and they will believe it. I mean, just anything. I mean, it could be like they ban jeans, or you can't wear flip-flops on Sundays, and it's just like people like just fall right in line with these racist caricatures. The same is the case with like, you know, the Middle East, where it's like people just kind of say it's broadly a violent area. It's just kind of where violence goes is over there to be violent. And it's like, people kind of settle into these folk psychologies, and there's not any resistance to this kind of blank uniform idea about the world until there's popular educators, until there's mass movements, until there's organizations actively trying to intervene in that kind of ideological headspace. So thanks to the organizers of this month-long thing, but also all of the speakers and everything, because it's so important, even on the universities and the nonprofits and all the places you might hear something like this, you hear about like logics, like the logic of jails, as opposed to classes, like the classes of people who put people in jails. It's like the logic of bullets rather than the war machine, like the specific US imperialism. Like learning about the Korean history that the US genocided this peninsula, I mean, just for 4 years. That the main complaint of the pilots was that they had nothing left to bomb. And in North Korea, there was no structure beyond one story. That is insane to me, and it's like, but I can actually see it because I see it in Palestine now. And so it's like, I just wanted to say this, which is that what is really broadly unifying about this is that if we settle around this conception of anti-imperialism, it greatly enhances all of our individual movements, rather than flattening them all into one sort of like, you know, partition space. And so like, you know, just as a socialist, it's like, it's just really amazing to see everybody coming together around one specific idea that imperialism, the US capitalist class, is the person behind the trigger. Right. Is the, like Netanyahu is not this individually bad politician, he's part of a broader capitalist class of imperialism to brutalize people out of existence and then control the narrative on the back end. And I really appreciate this space coming together educationally around that resistance. And I hope that in our nonprofits, in our universities, and our unions that we're hopefully all organizing right now, we're able to say, we are anti-imperialist through and through, and we will not be broken on this level of solidarity, because that's exactly when the nonprofit doesn't want to hear from you anymore. It's exactly when your professor's going to think, oh, is this good scholarship? You need to be anti-imperialist. That has to be bare minimum coming to the floor. Thank you all so much for
All right, so for the sake of time, I know I keep saying that, but we could keep the comments or questions and answers to about a minute or so. No, that was excellent. We needed that. So I think it's Max, Claire, Timur, and
Also, very quickly, the LC is obviously run by us, so it's okay if we go over time.
yeah. And if you don't put that out, that's fine too. But just want to respect people's time. So yeah, Max, Claire, Timur.
Yeah, I think with this like recent border flare up and like along India and Pakistan, there's like a lot of interest in like how those two countries sort of fit into the puzzle of like the U.S.'s like pivot to Asia. Like you have Pakistan using Chinese weaponry and like military equipment to like shoot down jets used by India that are made in America. So, but it's still like not a subject I know a lot about. So I was wondering if you guys had any comments on like how those two countries sort of like fit into this puzzle.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because you have these two nuclear powers, so that weirdly may provide us some comfort to know that, there's deterrence on both sides. But you have these two major powers that are allied with the US in different ways. So when you study, for instance, the history of the war on terror, or really even the history of the Cold War, Pakistan emerges as a key intelligence asset for the US. It was Pakistan that collaborated crucially with the US to train, the Afghan fighters that fought both the socialist government and the USSR in Afghanistan. And then you have India, which is pretty much like overtly fascist at this point under Modi. And it's actually interesting because Modi was like antagonized by the US as well for his crimes against humanity in Gujarat, but it was under Obama that Modi-US relations were largely normalized. Like Obama wrote this letter in Time magazine to Narendra, it was like an open letter to Narendra Modi, like celebrating both countries' commitments to capitalism, etc. And so then, of course, then you had, when Trump runs for president, he does there's like a rally in Texas for Modi and Trump, howdy Modi, and there's this whole thing, and they're very clear allies. So I think, in a weird way, you had these key assets to the US that were having beef, which is a beef that comes from British colonialism. It's a direct product of that. That it seems, has cooled down. But I have to say, from everything I've heard, the climate of jingoism and nationalism that just exploded in that week and a half, where you actually had major Indian news sources that were showing footage from Gaza saying, look what we've done to Pakistan. Or like, we've captured Lahore. Or like just stuff that was like fake news on major news channels. And then if the WhatsApp uncle chain thread is any indication of where it was very clear that here you have two countries that can quickly be tuned into like a very belligerent state. That kind of nationalist tension is there. I'm sure many of you saw it, but there was like a Pakistani official who was being interviewed by a British news anchor, and she was like, you've had so much instability in your country, you've had all these political assassinations, you've had disappearances, you've had all this, she names all this stuff about Pakistan. And you know what he responds? He's like, yes, we've been doing the US's dirty work for quite some time. And I was like, oh my God. So once again, I think it's impossible to understand that without understanding the US's role, and then of course understanding the long legacy of colonial residue from partition, which was really one of the most violent events in recent history. I mean, like my family is Indian. We have some family that migrated to Pakistan during partition, but it was, for the people who remember that time, and most of them are in the end of their life now, but it was a time when people, fled, leaving the keys to their home in their door, never to return. It was biggest movement of human bodies and just really lives in people's memory. Partition does in South Asia.
Excellent. All right, Claire, and then some more.
Oh, would you mind putting it on the tech slide? Okay, so yeah, this and some of what the speakers were saying made me think of the fact of like, basically our modern internet technology, all of it like starts with militarism. Like, the internet, the history of the internet, ARPANET was started by the US and the CIA, so as like counterinsurgency databases and communication tools in Vietnam. You know, the modern data analysis was like documenting all the things that are happening in Vietnam so that they could better like do their counterinsurgency and efforts. And so like that kind of carries forward. Not every piece of technology that we use is the military, but it has that roots at its core, and so I think that's really important for us to understand. But also that it is a tool, like the speakers were talking about with social media. It's a tool that we can also use for our own purposes, which is like to build solidarity, to build friendship. And it was also making me think about what are the historic kind of friendship tools that have been used. Like in the Cold War, there was like the sister city things happening, you know, cultural exchanges, people visiting each other, other friendship caravans, like all of these things that we could also the anti-nuclear movement. I think I want to say the 80s. Like that, I don't think we have a lot of that history. Like that was a really big, mass, popular movement that a lot of us don't know the history of. So, like not just looking at the history of like the national liberation movements, but like, you know, us being in the U.S., what are the U.S. based peace and solidarity movement history that we maybe are not familiar with, that we can look at those methods, modernize them for today, and like put them into our activism now.
Really excellent point. Thank you, Claire. All right, some more.
Okay, just first really quick following up on kind of the Pakistan-India question. I think like this case illustrates so well why having an overall framework of like internationalism and anti-imperialism is so clarifying, because there's so many conflicts around the world where it's like neither country is like they're both like doing bad things, but the really key important thing about anti-imperialism is that like we don't put political conditions on people not being like attacked by imperialism.
Yeah.
Like we don't, like even if we don't agree with, you know, the policies or the politics of a particular country, that's honestly, especially for us living in the US, completely irrelevant to whether we should fight the imperialist onslaught against them. So it allows us to just boil everything down to like, in what ways does this serve imperialism? In what ways does this combat imperialism? And just like allow us to like navigate politics a little bit more clearly, I think. But the other thing I want to say was just a question for the panelists is like, the panel was framed in terms of like, you know, these three interlocking crises. One of them is ecological destruction. And this issue of externalities came up. And also I was thinking of like in Hawaii, there's this case of like, it's called the Red Hill water crisis, but basically this underground fuel storage facility of the US military leaked and polluted this really major like water source for the island of Oahu in Hawaii. So I just kind of wanted to like re-emphasize that aspect of ecological devastation and its connection to imperialism, and just like invite the panelists to talk a little bit more about that, because I think sometimes it can fall into the background because it's not like the most visible thing as like a discrete phenomenon before our eyes, but at the same time it is like, as the framing of the panel kind of suggested, I think that's kind of like the creeping background of a lot of this, and it's so intimately tied with imperialism. So I just wanted to kind of like offer that up as a theme to take that.
Great question.
Immediately what comes to mind is, at least in the Philippines, the bombing of the Bakwit schools of like the Luma indigenous communities, which is like a collective identity of the indigenous peoples in Mindanao, Philippines. And, you know, like that intentional destruction of their schools where they're teaching them their ways, how to care for the land and take care of the environment. if you're killing the stewards, then that is causing environmental destruction that is like the tool of empire. And even the ways that we have seen indigenous genocide, I mean globally, but also like even just here in the US, what we have learned and also haven't learned, it is intentional to maintain the stake, to displace people from their lands, and yeah, it's causing ultimate destruction. And it, I don't know, it like always confounds me. I'm just like they're going to kill themselves too in this process. We're all gonna die before they do, but like they're gonna die too, like, or they're gonna get a spaceship or whatever. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Go ahead, Caitlin. Last question.
Yeah, so I feel like as people who either live in diaspora communities or are more connected to countries that have been colonized and controlled by the US, that the role of the US in imperialism is a lot more clear. But I think that as we see people within the United States, there is no more American dream. It doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter if you went to school. Like, the conditions are rapidly changing here. It really allows for people to be more open to anti-imperialism. It allows them to ask questions about actually what is going on. And yes, like, the propaganda machine of painting out these boogeymen is very real and very effective still, but I also think it's very generational, like to Nancy's point. An older generation more immediately buys in, and a younger generation is more prone to asking questions. So I just wanted to open it up to you guys as experts and organizers in different areas, as like, with that understanding that people's consciousness is on the rise and that being anti-imperialist is easier for people than it ever would be before, what do you think it's our role and task to really continue that, to utilize that, to fight back, to bring out the fighting spirit like you were talking about from your perspectives?
You know, one of the things that always surprises me in the classroom is how little like pushback I get. And you know, maybe that's true because of where I teach. Maybe that wouldn't be true elsewhere. But I have a remarkably easy time teaching about empire, and I wonder if it's part of it is what you're describing, which is like, here are people who, on some level, know that like in their lifetime there's going to be major ecological devastation, and that's just going to ruin everything. It's already happening, or that the crisis that like American liberalism has had has kind of taken them out. Like, there's no room anymore in this conversation for like the idea that, you know, America's a land of immigrants and we welcome everyone, which, you know, it used to be like you teach about migration, and now you can teach that story of like, here's a video about San Francisco's Chinatown. Okay. Or you can talk about why there needed to be a Chinatown in the first place, right? And when you actually teach about that, students are like, that is more interesting to me than this dumb like multicultural thing that has no purchase anymore, I think. And I think, like, you know, if you are lucky enough to ever have students, like, keep this in mind. Like, just remember that people are pretty thirsty for conversations about the material conditions. And you're kind of sticking to facts here. So you're like, okay, here, let's talk about, you know, and I teach this class on migration, and the way I teach it is everything starts with like a US military incursion in a place and then the wave of migration that follows. So we do like, you know, the Salvadorian Civil War, and like how the US trained the death squads at the School of the Americas in Georgia, and then the massacres that happened, and then suddenly there's a population from El Salvador. All right, now if you guys want to talk about scary Salvadorian gang members or whatever the news is peddling now, I mean, they kind of can't anymore, because I've introduced some historical nuance really here that makes that impossible. So I think maybe partly we've seen that, or maybe this is me being excessively hopeful, but I think like liberalism has outlived its usefulness. His nickname was Genocide Joe. They were Genocide Joe and Holocaust Harris. Like, people are fed up with that, and they see that. And so, you know, I think it maybe has opened up some space for us to have these conversations about empire.
I think that's a great place to end our panel discussion officially. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and like, I thank you for that, because it does show how we're going to have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, sit in the discomfort, and bring that to so many people's lives. But the thing is that, like, we're living in an empire, a thing that has promised us so many comforts, and to see it crumble is really hard to let go. And like, us as organizers, as people who are trying to reconcile, like, I mean, you know, we're not untouched by depression or despair in what we see today and over history, right? And so, like, we just have to be like we have to come from these communities. You have to make it make sense to them. Like, again, like the material conditions, like you should be able to like translate these ideas, deeply know them, like get to know their stories as well. Like for me, like actually I wanted to share, I couldn't figure out how to share it in the panel, but like help connect the dots for like the titas, the aunties at church. Like, you know, that's like somewhere that like I'm going to like integrate when we go organize with the Filipino community, because that's like their cultural center. We don't have a Filipino American center here in Philly yet. But you know, like that is the place to be involved in their lives and help them understand like why they need to participate in the anti-imperialist struggle, even if they may not ever say anti-imperialism in the next few days, but maybe they will, like, you know, in 5 years' time, like what. And that's like also the thing I wanted to mention that was like around counterinsurgency, but just thinking about the insurgent movement in the countryside in the Philippines, like the protracted People's War that the fighters there are waging, because again, it's generations of people who've been indoctrinated, decades and centuries of accepting imperialism, colonization, feudalism, bureaucrat capitalism. It's just corrupt. It's the way things will be, right? And so we have to see it as this long, long struggle of, if it's been here for centuries, I don't want the victory to come overnight. Like, how well is it going to sustain the next day after, right? And so it will take that sort of education. It will take multiple generations, but I think, yeah, getting people to that point of like accepting that you're gonna have to be uncomfortable in this undoing process. And then also just like wanna call like the justice for Auntie Lynn that we just won last Thursday. Being there, and to the panelists for being in our group chat, and I was like, come out to this action. Auntie Lynn is a Filipino worker. She's an SEIU union member in Washington State. But there was a national action because she had a hearing on Thursday. She was detained by ICE since February, right? And so she's been, you know, sharing about how awful those conditions have been, and we won her freedom. She was a community leader. To like free our community leaders and to, you know, so many are like Tita Lynn's story, so we must free them all. Of course.
So thank you. Another big round of applause for our panelists. Up, honestly, a lot of this slide, you know, we've heard from the audience, we've heard from the panelists, but I think the beautiful thing about being an anti-imperialist is in that phrase, you sort of identify the enemy and you identify where you stand, right? We need to be very clear that imperialism is the enemy, especially US imperialism, and build a movement. That's our task, right? We need to get our uncles and aunts, we need to get our family members, our community members together, understand who the enemy is, where we stand in their games that they play, and you know the risk that's coming, and the harm that's been done and continuing to be done, and again where we come together to fight it. One of these fronts, the major front here right today, is Palestine, and so when we think about our role again in the belly of the beast as United States citizens, or you know just being here and our taxpayer dollars funding the genocide that's going on in Palestine. We need to make it very clear that an attack against Palestinians, an attack against one of our community members, is an attack on all of us. Regardless of our background, regardless of who we are and what our communities we claim. So that's incredibly important, especially for folks who have just raised their voice in solidarity with Palestinians like Mahmoud Khalil or Yun So Chung. We need to be banding together and protecting these folks for saying things and believing the things that we do too. The last point here is just rejecting anti-communism and the new Cold War that the U.S. is employing against China. It's up to us as working class folks in America to come together and to really fight against the propaganda that is being shoved down our throats every day, whether it's by mainstream media or even within our own communities, to fight back and say China is not our enemy. In fact, U.S. imperialism is the enemy.
That's
right?
right.
Let's come together and fight. We will. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your spirit and your energy. There's obviously a lot of wonderful, build-up energy dedicated to building the anti-imperialism movement that we're seeing here today, and it perfectly embodies what the Liberation Center is, which is a space for this type of organizing and for solidarity work. We do want to highlight some upcoming events, so thank you again for sticking with us. So first, there are these events that are being hosted by Woori Center. On the 5th of June is going to be the last event in their series from the April Revolution, May 18th, and June Democracy Movement today. So if you're interested in learning more about Korean history and the Korean democracy struggle, please come and support Woori Center. And then they also have their gala coming up on June 21st from 6:30 to 9 p.m. That's going to be up in Northeast Philadelphia. And it's basically a fundraiser to build communities in this area. There's a lot of Korean elders that live in this area. A lot of them originally are from Gwangju and have lived through the Gwangju uprising and are participants of the Woori Center. And so if you can, definitely make it out to support them. And then we also have the series of events that's hosted by Bayan. Okay, did you want to talk about it?
Sure, yeah. So this is an exhibition that's over at Vox Popular Gallery that's over kind of near Chinatown, 11th and Callow Hill, if you haven't been there before. But yeah, this exhibition just displays, it's funny, the political cartoon was like earlier in the slide deck and we have it painted in our timeline. But it shows the negative impacts of US-Philippine military relations and the fight for national democracy in the Philippines. Everything that I mentioned about the military sites, we have it mapped out here, more explanation text. And then this timeline that shows the history of the U.S. coming into the Philippines and even to today. And it's really sad to see, but it's really helpful to see as a visual aid of just you'll see all these, of course, the white U.S. presidents who are building imperialism in the Philippines, and then you see Kamala Harris, and you see Obama also starting the visiting forces agreements and expanding EDCA, and so it's just it really doesn't change anything. They're still leaders of empire. So yeah. Go check that out. We have an open house if you're interested in learning more about Anak Bayan. Anak Bayan is under the umbrella of Bayan, the Youth and Students Organization. But anybody is welcome to come and learn more about what we do and to join our organization if you're interested. And then on June 14th, details TBD, but we are going to be having a US out of the Philippines banner drop. Again, if you remember, like I said at the beginning, June 12th is our Independence Day, but there's so many other Independence Day activities we didn't want to compete, so a little couple of days after. And yes, we are actively seeking endorsement for the US out of the Philippines campaign. Norito, we have done campaign activities to call for US out of Asia. So if any sort of endorsement, you don't have to be a Filipino organization, but to show your solidarity for US out of everywhere, we'd love to, or you can come up to me and ask if you want to have more details of what that looks like. Woo!
And we have some upcoming events here at the Liberation Center, including peer support for revolutionaries. Come and learn how to use somatic co-regulation as a tool in expanding our capacity to build unity. There's a lot of grim things that are happening in the world, and so it's important for us to uplift each other and to hold each other closely and support each other in these extremely rough times. We haven't publicly announced this yet, but we also will be hosting a Labor John live podcast episode here. That's coming up, I think, the 21st from 2 to 4. So if you're familiar with that podcast, it's two guys and they do different chapters of Philadelphia radical labor history, and they're going to be talking about the radical labor history of Kensington. And we're going to have other organizers come and share the struggles in Kensington today. Also, if you are part of an organization and want to host an event here, please let us know. We would love to collaborate. But speaking of Kensington, we also want to invite you out to this anti-police brutality protest that is being hosted next Saturday, the 7th at 1 p.m. It's going to be held at Somerset and Mutter Street for Angel Garcia, who was brutally murdered by Philadelphia police just last Wednesday. He was just walking on Somerset and Mutter when he was basically gunned down and choked to death. They hit him, they striked him in his stomach, he was unarmed, he was just walking about, and they murdered him. He was supposed to spend his time in Atlantic City this weekend with his family, and he can't do that anymore because the Philadelphia police murdered him. And so we definitely want to, exactly, and we're seeing the same types of military exercises, the same weapons that are being used, in Palestine, in Korea, in the Philippines. Those are all being exercised here in Kensington as another occupied area here in the U.S. And so the work is ongoing. Let's continue to build our communities together. Woo. And of course, we want to highlight the People's Summit for Korea that's coming up in July 25th to 27th. It's going to take place in New York City. But if you're interested, registration is open. It's going to be a 3-day summit with panel discussions, workshops, and breakout sessions from key organizers from the U.S. and South Korea. If you're interested in checking out the organizations, there's a broad coalition of organizations that are involved in fighting for Korean sovereignty and national liberation.
That wasn't me. Okay, so last but not least, please feel free to follow these organizations on Instagram. This is where you got a lot of the updates for events and whatnot, and these are a lot of the bottom line of organizing organizations for this past series and this past month. And as always, as we close off here, this is volunteer run. No one's getting paid to do this. We're not getting paid by the Democrats or the Republicans or anyone in between. We are an independently managed community center, so if you have any to give, we would love that, appreciate it. And yeah, just really want to say thank you again to everybody for sticking through this. I know everyone's probably trying to get out of here, but it was excellent energy today, really good feedback, analysis, and again, thank you again to the panelists for giving us their valuable time.